my name is Jack Petropoulos, and welcome to Groton Matters. At Groton Matters, we examine important issues in depth, in a fair and balanced and thorough manner, all in the interest of helping you to make informed decisions. Today is the second edition of Groton Matters, and today we're interviewing candidates for this November's race for state representative in the Middlesex District. It was our intent to have both the Democratic and Republican candidates here, that Democratic being Deb Busser and Republican being Sheila Harrington, and indeed both agreed to participate at first. Sheila later had some conditions that she required that we were unable to meet. They would have interfered with the ability to produce the show and might have actually made the show not so valuable to voters. And so eventually Sheila withdrew. So that means that we just have Deb here today. And while I'd prefer to have both candidates, having just Deb here allows us to go deep on more questions and to be more thorough with those questions and to maybe ask some questions back to Deb as she answers. So I'm really looking forward to this show. Let me first introduce Deb Busser. Deb, I'll read your bio in a second, but here's to you, Deb Busser, Democratic candidate for 1st Middlesex District.
Yeah, hi, Jack. I'm excited to be here, and again, really looking forward to talking with you and sharing some information about my campaign with the voters in Groton.
Great. Well, let me read you a little bit about Deb's bio. It's really quite impressive. Deb, as I mentioned, is the Democratic, not the Republican candidate for state representative in the 1st Middlesex District. She grew up in the 1st Middlesex District, where she chose to raise her family. She's a product of the North Middlesex and Groton Dunstable school districts. She's a first-generation graduate of UMass Lowell, where she got a bachelor's degree in business administration and marketing. Deb went on to get a master's in community social psychology at UMass Lowell, and she later taught there as an adjunct professor. In her early career in financial services, Deb had leadership roles in human resources and product marketing. In 2003, she went on to found her own consulting firms, where she supported organizational leaders. As a small business owner and an executive coach, she's partnered with hundreds of leaders in both large and small organizations, spanning multiple industries to improve strategic thinking, build internal and external relationships, and more efficiently develop their teams. In addition to her own practice, Deb has served as a leadership coach and facilitator for a number of executive education programs at the Harvard Business School. She has volunteered as a coach and mentor to nonprofit organizations whose mission is to support and elevate women of color. And lastly, Deb has served with the Prescott School Community Center Board of Directors, where she led the development committee. Welcome, Deb Busser.
Thank you, Jack. Great to be here.
Good. So let me give the viewers just a quick sort of outline of what we'll be doing here today. We expect to spend just under an hour. We've got 14 questions, the majority of which were provided by voters following a request for questions earlier last month. The questions are, I think, really quite balanced, and they were intended to be the same questions that we would ask both candidates. So there's really been no sorting of questions for one candidate now that Deb is here on her own. I did provide Deb and intended to provide both candidates with the general topics we'd be discussing ahead of time, so they would know that we'd be talking about such things as vaping and or MBTA, transportation, etc. But they've not seen the questions ahead of time. What I'm going to do is give you those same topics along with the timestamps where we discuss them in a screenshot that you'll see just after I finish here. So you can pause the video and take a look at the 14 topics and the timestamps for when we discuss them and decide if you want to fast forward to those topics. I urge you to watch the whole video. I think we're going to have some interesting discussions and some important information come from the Democratic candidate. But if you need to fast forward and get to some specific topics, we'll have given you the opportunity to do so. In addition, the Groton channel has found a way to close caption this broadcast, so we'll make this available to the hearing impaired, and also the text from the closed captioning will go out to the Groton Herald so they can write articles for publication about it. So without further ado, we can start off with question one. Deb, I want to start with a relatively easy one, maybe not easy, but something that I'm sure you've been asked a lot, and that is that you're going to come into this with no political background. Your opponent has 9 years of experience in the role. The question to you is, how will you come up to speed and provide more value than your opponent would?
Yeah. So thanks for the question, Jack. Agreed. There have been the representative has been in the office for 9 years, and I'll be honest. When I thought about running, I wasn't sure whether I was the right candidate or not. But I went into the ballot box in 2018 and had nobody to vote for on the Democratic side, and not for the first time. And that's when I sort of walked out and said, I think maybe I could do this job. Maybe I have something to bring. And so, although it was never my intention to run for political office, had not been on my radar screen prior to that, although I had been involved in some campaigns, I went out and started asking questions of everybody I could. And I think what I've realized upon reflection is that I've actually been training for this job my whole life. And I would say that's true academically, professionally, and personally. So academically, as you mentioned, I have a degree in business and I have a degree in community social psychology. And I think that combination is unique. It allows me to look at big problems that are usually intersectional within a community and have a sort of a business lens in terms of how we solve those problems. So although I'm very much in favor of investing in our communities, I also care about return on investment, and it has to make economic sense. So I think that's a unique lens. Professionally, as you mentioned, I've worked with hundreds of organizational leaders over the last few years. And again, have had a broad experience in understanding different industries, different functions that I think is really useful as a state representative. You have to be a generalist. You cannot do this job by yourself, and you have to be able to leverage the expertise of the people around you. I think I do that really well, and have the experience of bringing diverse groups together to actually get to sustainable solutions. And I personally, as you mentioned, I grew up in this district, and there were times when we needed, my family had some challenges as I was younger, and there were times when we needed support from the state. And I'll tell you, sometimes those things worked out and sometimes they didn't. And I want to make sure that they do work out on behalf of the residents of the First Middlesex District. And that's why I'm committed to doing this. I do think I have a different skill set, but I think it's going to be valuable. And quite honestly, we have enough attorneys on Beacon Hill. Nothing against attorneys. My daughter is taking the bar in a couple of weeks, but I think we need some diversity of thinking. And I think I'm going to bring something different and unique that's going to be valuable.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Sure.
The second question is similarly common question, I think. And that is that in the most recent election, 2018, the Democratic majority increased from 120 up to 127 out of the 160 representatives, leaving only one independent and 32 Republicans. So the question to you is there a downside in reducing and continuing to reduce the meaningful Republican representation in an overwhelmingly Democratic House of Representatives?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And you're right, I have heard that from a number of folks. As I mentioned, I'm somebody who appreciates diversity. I actually led diversity training back in the 90s. So diversity in opinion and thought is important to me. I do think the reality is the Democrats do have a supermajority. They have for a long time. They probably will for a long time. That said, I think there's a lot of variation within Democrats and pretty broad along the spectrum. And I think you have both Democrats and Republicans who are effective, and Democrats and Republicans who are not so effective. I think I've heard my opponent talk about the fact that this is about the person and not the party. And for the most part, I agree with that. However, what I would say is that our current representative votes with her party, the Republican Party, 97% of the time. So, and the reality is, most often, the Democrats are actually prevailing, right? So I actually think the question might be, or one of the benefits of having a Democrat, even though there were plenty, is having folks who can actually come on board and people you can build coalitions with. So I've been talking with Senator Kennedy, Senator Eldridge, Representative Tammy Gouveia, Representative Dan Senna, in building those relationships for the past 2 years. I've been endorsed by Dan Senna. I've been endorsed by Congresswoman Trahan. And I think having more people who are actually fighting for the same things is actually going to be a benefit for this district.
Great. So let's move to something a little more specific. It's still a national issue, but it's specific to Massachusetts here, and that's police reform. Your opponent voted against House Bill 4860, which was an act relative to justice, equity, and accountability in law enforcement in the Commonwealth. The fact is that she was joined by a number of other Democrats, a good number of other Democratic state representatives, and Groton's police chief. So the question to you is, how would you have voted on that bill, House Bill 4860, which is, again, an act relative to justice, equity and accountability in law enforcement in the Commonwealth. And specifically, do you share any of the concerns of those who opposed it?
Yeah. So great question. I think first what I want to say is you can be very supportive of the local police that we have in our district. We are fortunate to have incredible departments. I've met with the leadership in most of them, and I know for a fact that we have committed, loyal people who really are part of our community, and we need them. And so I think, first of all, I want to say that I think you can acknowledge great policing in our district and still be in favor of police reform. And so I would say I'm both in those areas. My kids remember Chief Downs. They grew up in Dunstable, coming out on the first day of school, and it was a big deal that he would come to the end of the street to the bus stop. And I think it was really true community policing. That was their experience of the police. And, you've probably heard, I have, other people when they talk about what sort of police reform looks like or what people would like to see, it's often the experience that we're having here in the suburbs. So I think, again, I don't want to take anything away from the incredible law enforcement we have in that district. That said, clearly the events of this spring and in this summer have, opened our eyes much wider, I think most people, in terms of, the ongoing institutionalized systemic racism that exists in our society. And I think there's something that we need to do about that. In terms of this particular bill, I want to say a couple of things. First, there was a version that went through the Senate that I think was far more expanded, much larger. So, and I think the House bill, a lot of people would say that the House bill really watered down a lot of the language that was in the Senate bill. To me, one of the most important parts of this bill, and I think most people would agree, was the idea of creating a certification committee. Massachusetts is one of only 3 states that do not certify our police officers, which makes no sense. We certify nail technicians. We're not certifying police officers. When I've had conversations with law enforcement leadership, I actually have heard that they've had difficulty at times in disciplining police officers on their force, in terminating folks, people they thought were going away who were able to have their records expunged and come back. That's a problem, and I have heard that. So I didn't hear anybody that was, didn't have conversations with anybody in law enforcement who was against the idea of certification. I think a lot of the debate started to become around the composition of the committee. And the Senate version versus the House version versus the governor's version all look different. So it's in conference committee right now. We'll see how it turns out. But I would say, I guess the other thing that I would say, I've heard the critique that this was a knee-jerk reaction, and that's actually not the truth. There were major components of this bill that had been held up in the Judiciary Committee for some time, of which our current representative is a ranking member. There's been advocacy on a number of these issues for a long time, and I think to ignore that is really disingenuous. And I guess ultimately, I would have voted for the bill is the answer to the question. I think that there are going to be activists who think it did not go far enough. There are other folks who think it went too far, but I think we did need to act and be sensitive to the moment, and I think there's still more to do.
Great. Well, thanks for being clear on how you would have voted. One of the other aspects, though, is to understand. I ask if you understand some of the concerns of those who did vote against it, and at least can address those concerns. Maybe not agree with those concerns, but do you understand those concerns?
Yeah, the answer is yes and no. And I should clarify, it's easy to sit here from the outside and say I would have voted yes or no. The reality is I was not in those conversations. I'm not a sitting legislator. I did not hear the testimony. So I guess I want to clarify that I'm giving that answer based on outside information. It's difficult for me to know sort of what, why Democrats voted the way they voted. My suspicion is some of them felt it went too far. And so I know there are some folks who didn't vote yes because they didn't think it was far enough. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Let's, on a national issue, but bringing it home a little bit again, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple aspects of COVID. COVID and mental health. What impact have you seen the COVID crisis have on mental health in Massachusetts? And how can you work to address that impact?
Yeah. So I think the COVID crisis has had a huge impact on issues in Massachusetts, starting even beyond mental health, right? I think it's an intersectional issue. It's impacted housing for folks. It's impacted employment. It's impacted education. I mean, you've seen the ramifications of this pandemic are far-reaching, and they absolutely are having a significant impact on mental health. People who are used to getting services, attending in-person support groups, are dealing with social isolation in a way that we never could have anticipated. There was a statistic I saw recently that 2 out of 5 adults in the United States are dealing with anxiety or depression. 2 out of 5 is a staggering number. And I think we ignore that at our peril. I think we really need to make sure that we are directing services to make sure that whoever needs mental health services are getting them. I think maybe one of the silver linings of this crisis was some of the changes that were made to make sure that insurance was available for mental health services. And I think we need to make sure that insurance companies, that there's parity with the medical health insurance that they're providing. There should be the same thing for mental health services. So that's the one thing I would say. The second thing is that we were able to expand options for access during this pandemic by using things like telehealth and other types of remote options. We need to make sure that stays. I think it was a temporary order, and I think we need to make sure that stays. Again, the more we can make access easier for folks who need that support, we need to do that.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Again, on a national level and COVID related, Governor Baker extended the eviction prohibition in Massachusetts until mid-October. Indeed, the CDC provided a far more expansive prohibition for a longer period of time. But back to Governor Baker's actions, and this really goes to how you think about these things. So please, at least in part, answer that way. What about the impact to landlords and property owners of a prohibition on evictions?
Yeah. So again, I think it's important to understand the backdrop, right? We have been in an unprecedented public health crisis to which we never ever could have anticipated or imagined. I think the bill that came out was written by the Housing Committee, and it was something that had to be acted on quickly. The last thing we needed in a public health crisis of this size and scope, and you think about how quickly things were accelerating in Massachusetts back in March and April, was to put families out on the street. That would only exacerbate the crisis that we're already in, could have actually increased transmission rates. I don't think there was any other choice but to make sure that those folks were protected, honestly, from a public health standpoint. That said, I truly recognize that, there are landlords who rely on that income, right? That's important. And so I think we have to figure out how both sides get some relief. Again, I think, it was something that had to be acted quickly upon. And I think it was the right thing to do. That said, I've been watching to see what legislation has come out since then. And we do need to look at how we actually provide relief going forward.
Certainly, it would be costly to provide relief for landlords, but you gotta have a feeling for these people who have their own commitments, and who are having banks and others breathe down their throats for payments for which there is not a prohibition on
That's right.
on foreclosure, et cetera. Yeah, how would you? It's a tough question to ask, but what kinds of things could pay for something like that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there are ways that there's certainly funding, and we can talk about how, funding is going to get challenging at a state level. But I think, that certainly this is an area where the federal government has to come in. I think probably falls under FEMA, and it was the same way of being displaced from your home, or the risk of being displaced. And I think we need to be aggressively, and I'm sure that the governor is, pursuing as much federal relief for this as we can. Great.
So this one's near and dear to me because I spent time on the MBTA commuting between Ayr and Boston, and as have many of us. And anyone who's sat at the Ayr or Shirley train stations waiting for a train in February knows the pain. What can you do to improve the rail commute from Ayr and Shirley into Boston? And again, how would that be paid for?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I mean, clearly, this is a huge issue. And I was hearing a lot more about it, I will say, sort of pre-pandemic, about the commute that people are facing and getting into Boston. What I think we need to understand is we've been kicking the can down the road on this for a long time. We've not been investing in transportation or infrastructure for way too long. And that's why I think we're in such dire straits in terms of now finally addressing it. What I think is important to understand is that this really is, again, another issue. There's a public health implication to people spending hours in traffic every day. There's an environmental implication to people being in single cars, sitting in traffic every day. So we need to solve it for a whole bunch of reasons. I think the first thing we need to do is make our transit work better, our public transit. So, that includes, in my mind, electrification of the Fitchburg line. Right now there's 2 trains you can catch out of air before 9 o'clock. And if you miss those trains, right, you're out of luck. If you need to come back during the day because something happens at your kid's school, you're out of luck. So that makes it a less viable option for people inside the district. And I think we need to figure out, again, how to get faster, more frequent service so that people want to take it. You have to incentivize people to actually take the train. More people taking public transit actually does bring down the cost over time. I think we need to look at what's called micro mobility solutions, right? How do you solve that first mile, last mile? And that is, whether it's a shuttle from a certain area in a town that's bringing people to the train station. I think that includes, bike lanes and sidewalks. Right now, in fact, there's in AIR, there's a group that's looking at how to get people from the AIR train station to the industrial park over on Westford Road, right? There are a whole bunch of people that are taking the train from Fitchburg. It's that last mile where the opportunity is. And I think we need to look at partnerships with corporations. They are really invested in this. And there's a whole group out of Boston that is really invested in trying to make sure that we can do that. I think the second thing I would say that was we need to improve our roads. We are not getting enough Chapter 90 funding for sure, but we're also not asking for and advocating in the way that we need to. There was a transportation bill that came out in this session where there was $18 billion given in earmarks to certain communities for things like paving roads and bridges and rail trail maintenance. Nothing was requested on behalf of the First Middlesex District, and we received nothing.
That's interesting to note. The tough question on all of these questions really, though, is how do you pay for it? Do you have any specific targets that you'd go after to pay for these improvements that you're talking about? Can you name any bullet list of places you'd go, how you might do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we do need to look at the millionaire's tax. I believe that's something my opponent is against. It's something I'm for. I think there's an opportunity to pay for some of these things that really are investments in our long-term future that, again, that really can't wait anymore. So I think that is absolutely a way. But again, I've heard and been involved in conversations where there are partnerships we can build with the corporations, particularly that are closer to Boston, who really understand what a challenge this is and how it impacts productivity, how it impacts their employees' lives. And I think there's a lot more willingness than people might understand or expect in terms of being part of those solutions.
2 options, great. This next question is really quite local, and it's a little in-depth and requires a bit of background. It's about municipal electric regulation. So municipal light departments like GELD across Massachusetts have been under regular threats or pressures from legislation to increase their renewable energy portfolios and to comply with the same regulations to which investor-owned utilities are held.
Yep.
The municipal departments claim that this will impact costs, independence, and reliability. Your opponent has defended the municipal department's special status of being exempt from these regulations and having sort of assuring their local control. So the question to you is, how would you approach the challenge, and very real challenge, of imposing environmental regulations on municipal light departments? And specifically, what impacts do you foresee on rates, local decision-making, and reliability?
Yeah. So I think what I would want to say first is that municipal electric light departments are unique. And, I'm somebody who lived in Dunstable for 17 years before moving back to Groton. So I am very much aware as a consumer. The experience is night and day, right? And GELD does an amazing job of providing, great service exceptional service and comparable service, I would say. When things go wrong, we know they're going to be there in a heartbeat. We know that our rates are half of what they are in some of the surrounding districts or surrounding towns. And their portfolio right now is 70% renewable. I think, and it keeps increasing year over year. I think to your point, the definitions keep changing. And that's one of the real difficulties for a small, municipal light department like Geld, is you're trying to sort of meet their regulations, and the definitions keep changing. So what I would say is that clearly something needs to be done about the IOUs that service other parts of the district, the Unitils, the National Grid, that are just for profit, and it's really obvious in terms of how they service or don't service their customers. I think there needs to be some oversight there, but I would agree that Geld is working really well. I don't know why we'd want to mess with that, and I think we'd want to protect the local control.
So, does protecting local control, what does that mean if legislation wants to have increased renewable energy, say it would force Geld to go beyond their 70% renewable energy portfolio today, and Geld tells you that's going to increase cost and decrease reliability. I don't know that there's a perfect answer for this, but I'm interested in how you would think about that dilemma.
Yeah, I think it's a balance. I had a conversation with Kevin Kelly recently, and we actually talked about there's some legislation that's proposing that they go from increasing the amount of renewables from 2% per year to 3% per year. And so I said, and he was like, and Kevin's really confident, that he can beat the IOUs anytime. And I said, at what point, 3% a year is great and you keep meeting that, but at some point, right, like when what's the ceiling? And his perspective was that it's probably around 80%. So I do think, we have to incentivize people to go to cleaner energy. It's critically important for our environment. Like it is not sustainable to sort of go on the way that we have and to ignore all of the impacts of climate change. That said, I think, when there's a small organization inside and that's working as well as Geld is working, we need to protect them. We need to make sure that they're held accountable too. But I think it's a different, as in many cases, we're trying to apply a one-size-fits-all solution, and it doesn't fit. And I think we need to actually call that out.
So you're saying that regulations that you might be a part of promulgating might recognize the special status of municipal utilities while still holding them to the general goals, but not necessarily the specific goals.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And again, I think we also have to be careful about, I think we have to be careful about the language changing. They shouldn't have to be dancing around every time because one regulator is defining renewable this way and somebody else is defining renewable that way. I think we do need to give them a lot more cover.
Great. Back to national issues, and this is a classic one, but bring it home, if you will, gun control. Is there a need for additional gun control in the state or at the local level? And if so, what might you propose?
Yeah. So, in my family, we had hunters. I have an uncle and cousins who went up to Maine during hunting season, and that was important. And to them, my dad for a time had a job where he had to have a gun. It was part of his job. He also knew how to lock it up. What I would say is I don't think there's any need in our community for military-style weapons. In fact, I think that creates a greater danger for our law enforcement, right? If those things are on the street, it actually endangers the people who are trying to keep us safe. That said, I think, background checks make a lot of sense, and making sure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who we know are likely or have a propensity to potentially hurt themselves or other people. So I really think it's about expanded and more robust background checks. I teach a dance class at Prescott once a week, and I've had a background check. So I think if we're able to do background checks for things like that, we can actually do a far more, a much better job about background checks for people who are going to be carrying guns. So that's
got it. On another national issue that is that I almost considered not including in today's questions because it seemed such a moot point here in Massachusetts until maybe a week ago, that of abortion rights. So here in Massachusetts, your opponent proposed a bill in 2012 on anesthetizing fetuses. That didn't become law, and I think it just went to study and has stayed in study. But more recently, the Roe Act, which is House Bill 3320, I believe, would reform the state's abortion laws, ensuring that anyone, regardless of age, income, or insurance, can access safe legal abortion. So where do you stand on abortion rights? And more specifically, how do you see these two different initiatives, the Roe Act and the anesthetization of fetuses?
So again, I will say that as I contemplated running for state representative, it was not on my radar screen that I would need to be talking about reproductive rights and reproductive freedoms. And I think you're right. I think, particularly in light of Justice Ginsburg's passing, that is on people's minds. And I think it needs to be in Massachusetts, because I don't think that people realize that really access is under attack. What is it? Roe versus Wade was 1973. We're decades past that, and we're still having this conversation, and access is still an issue, and it should not be. So yeah, what I would say, I think this is an area where my opponent and I differ dramatically. Of the few bills she's filed in her 10 years in the legislature, a majority of them have been about restricting reproductive rights. And based on the particular bill that you're referencing, that's based on medically inaccurate information. She doesn't take the floor often. In this case, she did take the floor to question medical professionals who actually told her that some of the things she was talking about didn't exist. So I think people need to understand that there are people in our state house, and in fact, again, our current representative is the ranking member of the judiciary, which is holding this up from even getting to the floor for a vote. And we need access to our reproductive rights and making sure that's available to anybody who needs it. I mean, when it's not available, it disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable. And I think that's unacceptable in this day and age.
Thank you. Another national issue that has actually kind of specific relevance here at home, and that is the removal of statues and monuments. And we could describe it a dozen different ways, but I think this sort of topic heading does that. Nationally, we've seen a lot of activity around the naming and icons such as statues. But this is not just a national issue. We've seen examples of that here in our hometown, including an effort to remove the Bible from our town seal a couple of years ago. So the question to you is, would you support the removal of statues, or other public memorials, or the renaming of public buildings or symbols? And if so, which ones and what kinds? And lastly, how would you, and perhaps this is the most important thing, I think, to me anyway, and the question is, how would you go about evaluating such initiatives?
Yeah. So, what I would say, Jack, is, one of the reasons why I, chose to stay in this district, I'm grateful that I grew up here, is the real sense of history that we have, right? We can feel it, see it all around us. And I really appreciate, sort of the noble causes that many of the folks who came before us, were engaged in. I will say that, I know this is something that is near and dear to you. It is not something I've heard about as I've been talking to voters. And maybe that's just because we have way too many other things to be worried about right now and focused on in light of the pandemic and a whole host of other issues that I think are concerning. But what I would say is that I think this is an area where because of what's happening nationally, I think people are starting to question those things. And I think those conversations are good and they're healthy. I do think that in order to get to the right answer, you need to include the people in the community. And I think but I think having those dialogues in order to do so is very important.
Yeah, it's not something you hear about a lot until it comes up. And then when it comes up, there are signs everywhere, and your town meetings get very difficult around these issues. So it's useful, I think, for voters to understand how their representatives think about these things so that they can feel well represented in the decision-making processes that happen before the initiatives come to the public's attention or to the public for a vote.
Sure. Well, what I would say is that when it does, the few times it's come up, what I hear about more is government overreach, right? And that this is an area where perhaps the state should stay out of it. And I think this is another example of, local control.
Great. So this next question is about voting attendance, and much has been made about your opponent's roll call attendance last year. In August of 2019, the Worcester Telegram reported that Representative Harrington had missed almost 85% of roll call votes. This placed her in the bottom 6 of 160 members. in the House.
Yeah.
For perspective, during the period, almost half of the representatives had a 100% roll call attendance. Now, to be fair, the year before, the Telegram reported that Representative Harrington had near perfect roll call attendance. And so with this, while these are newsworthy events, particularly last year's performance, what it points out is that attendance is a challenging thing, and many representatives have some very difficult attendance records. And some of those who explained them, Representative Harrington did not for the Worcester Telegram when asked. Many of them explained that they run into personal issues that just make attendance hard. And I wonder how you see that. I wonder what voters should expect from you in terms of your attendance, and what would you accept as a reasonable excuse for missing votes?
Yeah. So first of all, Jack, I want to clarify. Representative Harrington missed 15% of the votes, not 85%.
So I apologize.
Yeah, just want to make sure that we're clear on that. Now, that still put her in the bottom 5 for attendance, but it was 15%, not 85. So I think it's important.
I stand corrected, Devin. Thank you for fact checking me on that. Obviously have my facts wrong here.
Yeah, but I think bottom 5 is still very concerning, and you're right. She has been asked to comment on that. When other folks were asked to comment on that, sometimes it was because they were in active duty military service. That seems like a darn good reason to me. Sometimes it was because they were, doing something on behalf of their district somewhere else, and sometimes there were, other personal factors. I think either way, voters deserve to know. I mean, there's some accountability there. So I would have expected some type of comment on why that's true. I think one of the things that is just really important is that we have, representation. And again, as I mentioned, currently our representative votes with, when she is voting, it is 97% of the time with Republican leadership.
Great. And again, thank you for the fact check. The next question, again, comes from voters and has to do with vaping. House Bill 4183 prohibited flavored tobaccos and vaping products, including menthol cigarettes. It passed 127 to 31, with your opponent voting against it. And the question to you is, what's your position on regulation of vaping products? And do you share any of the concerns of those who were opposed to the bill? Again, you can see this sort of continued theme here of asking whether you understand the reasons that some people oppose the thing.
Yeah, I do. I believe I understand some of the reasons why people oppose that bill. I think, what I think is super important is our small businesses, and they are vital to our communities. And I think a vote against the vaping bill would have been to really protect our small businesses. And I can understand that perspective. I actually have heard Representative Harrington speak on this a couple of times. And as she talks about protecting small businesses, which of course is important, and they are vital to our communities, so is human life. And so you have to put yourself into sort of the time in which that was enacted. And what was happening is people were dying. And so to actually vote on a bill that was going to pass overwhelmingly, number one, I don't understand how that's an accomplishment. But number two, I think it really disregards the real impact this was having in our communities. And I think that's really concerning. What I would have preferred to hear, just as a constituent when I was listening, is, this was my issue with this particular bill. And so this was the amendment that I proposed, or this is how I talk to people, to try and make it a better bill. I don't think it's enough to just sit there and vote yes or no. Like, you have to be involved in shaping those conversations. You have to be involved in shaping that legislation. And if it's not what you think it should be, you need to propose some amendments and be active about it. I think there's just a fundamental way in which we view this job that I think is very different.
Great. So the last question is sort of an open-ended one, and it's really about your thoughts on your opponent. And really, the question gives you sort of an opportunity for a summary. And what's the one thing that you'd like to say to the public about your opponent?
Yeah, I think that the one thing I would like to say is that we're missing out. We're just missing out on a lot of opportunities. We're missing out on, and I think that's really the biggest issue. And I'll be honest, I didn't understand the degree to which we were missing out until I started to run and started to have conversations with people all over the district. And people who are in elected positions in some of our government who need funding for certain things. And our representative is consistently voting for bills that provide funding to other communities, but doesn't actually make a request on our behalf. I don't understand that. I think it's really problematic. There's a recent example, just even with the supplemental COVID bill, where, Andover got $300,000 for their town hall having to do with COVID recovery. I don't even understand what that is, but that's a heck of a lot of money. And I've been sitting at, every town meeting this spring and seeing things on the warrant article. And there have been opportunities for us to get funding for some of these things that's not even being requested on our behalf. Don't understand it. I think the second thing, and again, I think this speaks to how we view the job. The second thing is being proactive with the legislation that's being proposed on our behalf. And in this session, there's been nothing proposed on education, energy, the environment, transportation, healthcare. Like, those are the things that I hear about from voters. Those are the things that they care about. And there has been nothing proposed on our behalf from our current representative. I think the third component, and this is, again, how I view the job, what I think is important, and that I think the measures of success are, is constituent services. It's being accessible to your constituents when they need you. When most people are reaching out to their state representative, it's because something is wrong. Something serious is going on in their lives. They need to know that they can reach that person by email, by phone. There need to be regular office hours. Back to the earlier conversation, we deserve to hold our representative accountable. They work for us. And I think it's a full-time position. It needs a full-time focus. And I think that's what I would say.
Great. Well, that wraps up our questions. I want to give you, Deb, an opportunity just to provide your closing thoughts. So please take whatever time you like and let us know what you'd like voters to know about you.
Yeah, I think this has been super comprehensive, Jack. So I thank you for all the work and foresight that went into preparing for this. I think hopefully people have a sense of where I'm coming from. I believe that I am really open and interested in diverse positions. I think there's a real opportunity here for us to have a louder voice at the State House and to have somebody working proactively, not just reacting on our behalf. So I guess that's what I would say to voters. To you, I would just say, I appreciate the opportunity very much. I think you're providing an important service to the voters of our town, and more information and thoughtful, sort of balanced information is always good. So I appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, you're more than welcome. But it's nothing if we don't have people like you come here and participate, willing to take tough questions you haven't heard in advance, and think on your feet and provide answers that come from the heart. So thank you for participating. It's what makes the show. And I also want to give great thanks to Bob Coleman and Ashley Doucette, who work for the Groton Channel, who have helped to produce this show and have just made it come off as well as it has, or as it will, and have helped to add the special touches that I think will make it more valuable to voters, the closed captioning, the indexing of timestamps, etc. So really, Bob and Ashley, thank you very much. And to those of you that watch, thanks for taking the time to watch. And I hope this was valuable to you. I hope you saw it as even-handed, as thorough and balanced. I tried to be as tough as I can, and still provide an objective opportunity for the candidate to provide her input. I apologize again for Representative Harrington's absence and understand her reasons for not participating. I do invite feedback. If you found something here that could have been done better, if you would like to comment on something that you saw that you really liked, please do provide feedback. And you can do so by going to the GrotonMatters.com, where this video will be available, and just entering comments in the comments section. You can enter those comments anonymously if you like, and please don't hesitate to provide criticism as well as positive feedback. So with that, I would like to say that, again, thank you for watching, and please remember to vote this November. Thank you.